Thanks, Gina. If I attempt to write another book, I will be divorced. But anyway, it's always a great pleasure to come to Glenties, partly because the audiences here are so engaged and so willing to explore and talk about and interrogate ideas. Not, I have to confess, like the audience of my fellow swimmers on the beach at Nairn Strand this morning, when my choice to put on a wetsuit was led to some rather personal, I felt, questioning of my general manliness, and was extrapolated into a summary of all the failings of the younger generation. Unfortunately, none of my fellow swimmers were stung by the jellyfish to make my point, however. In the months after the bank guarantee in 2008, the topics of conversation amongst the Irish public changed dramatically. Contracts for difference and credit default swaps suddenly littered your average pub conversation as people acquainted themselves with the heroes and villains of the financial world. Politics became familiar once again with finite budgets. Economists, God help us all, became sexy and sought after, and this appeared to drive some of them quite over the edge. This much is widely known and commented upon. What is less appreciated is that it started a fairly dramatic increase in public engagement with politics. People didn't see the failures of the political system and walk away from it. They became energised and walked towards it. Audiences for political programmes on radio and television increased significantly. All politicians will tell you that daily events were followed more widely and more thoroughly. And of course, there was a welcome increase in the numbers willing to purchase modestly promoted books about politics, which sought to explain the suddenly changed landscape and how we got there. More profoundly, I think, the collapse of 2008, 2009 and 2010 led to a sort of society-wide insecurity. The fundamental expectations that people had concerning their careers, their housing, their education and their standards of living changed overnight. And in a circumstance where people were questioning their own expectations and beliefs, of course, they were going to extend this to politics. The collapse of the largest party of government, the party which, above all, represented the failing establishment, was the most obvious sign of this. We measured it in polls and explained it with personalities. The fall of Fianna Fáil was the fall of the old political attitudes. But what we didn't appreciate enough, I think, is how much wider and deeper the change in political sentiment was. Because people understood that what had happened was not just a failure of parties and personalities, but a failure of their political system, the way we develop, implement and oversee political decisions. This much is clear in opinion polls and political research then and since. It was also obvious to anyone who spent time knocking on doors with politicians during the 2011 general election campaign. I think, is that one of your voters, Deputy? Yeah. This is the new establishment, Stanley. I think, though, what we have seen since then is not a profound change of the old system, but rather a refurbishment of it, which has left its core elements untouched. And I suggest that in 2011, at a moment of existential danger for the Irish system, which had been seen by many of its citizens to fail, the system was in fact saved by the Fine Gael and Labour coalition. It's clear to most of us, I think, that this government is a better government than the last one. But I don't think you can seriously argue that it has changed the way we do politics. And partly, and principally perhaps, I suggest, this is because our political system, albeit refurbished, is an expression of a deeper political culture. So what we have seen from people is a demand to change the political system without the underlying political culture undergoing any change itself. The expectations and demands of our electoral system remain the same, and I'll return to this point later. One point, I think, of illustrating this is to consider one of the most frequently asserted tropes of Irish politics, the public demand for change. But ask yourself, how many times is it made clear, change to what? Much less frequently, because the political culture is suspicious of change. What it has, it holds. It often considers proposals for change to be part of almost an elite conspiracy. The engagement that most citizens have with politics is through their participation in the electoral system. And the electoral system, I suggest, and many other people do also, is one of the principal reasons that we have the sort of politics that we have. And people say they are unhappy with the politics we have. But there is zero chance of them ever changing the electoral system. So if you look at it this way, and you consider the results of the recent elections, I think we may be seeing a rise in protest voting at the expense of change voting. A large minority voting to make a statement, albeit one of dissatisfaction and frustration, but just a statement rather than to support a programme. Because defining what you want to change to entails upsetting some people. And one of the bedrocks of Irish political culture is to avoid upsetting or offending anyone. Let's go back momentarily to the midst of the crisis, back to the future, as it were. And the public appetite for system change was something that an extremely effective Fine Gael electoral machine understood. They saw early on that people needed to be shown that Fine Gael was serious about a word previously missing from the Irish political lexicon: reform. There's no question, I believe, that the October 2009 call for the abolition of the Senate was driven by market research saying that Fine Gael had to show it wanted to change the system rather than just gain control of it. It was a dramatic statement, all right, but perhaps in retrospect it should have warned people about what was to come. Because if the Senate was, as the government's campaign maintained, irrelevant, if it didn't perform any useful function that couldn't be carried out elsewhere, then how could its abolition represent a fundamental changing of the system? Effectively, what we saw in that policy, and much of what we have seen since, is the renovation of an old structure. It wasn't supposed to be like this. After years of being dismissed as a poor public performer, Enda Kenny marked the 2011 election by crafting one of the most memorable soundbites of the modern Irish political age. The day after the election, he announced that Ireland had just seen a democratic revolution. The phrase flashed around the world. Google it and see what happens, see how many places it pops up. And it's the phrase's pungency and potency gave it a powerful engine in the days after the election. A week later, it framed the opening lines of the programme for government, which I think is worth quoting. On the 25th of February, a democratic revolution took place in Ireland. Old beliefs, traditions and expectations were blown away. At the stroke of a pen, in thousands of polling stations created this political whirlwind. The public demanded change and looked to parties that would deliver the change they sought. Well, I don't know about you, but from where I'm standing 3 years later, it doesn't exactly look like St. Petersburg in 1917. I mean, the place is hardly unrecognisable now, is it? There have been some reforms under the coalition, to be fair. Some of them have been very useful. Some useful and relatively minor changes have been made to the way Parliament does its business. The government has introduced a pre-legislative stage for new laws, where a Dáil committee can discuss the general outline of the sponsoring minister's proposal. The Chief Whip, as he does every couple of months, enunciated on this in the Dáil recently. The pre-legislative stage, he said, will allow for unprecedented and extensive engagement by the public in lawmaking. The relevant committee will be able to consult experts and civic society. However, it's entirely voluntary. The minister doesn't have to do it, and if it does happen, he doesn't have to listen to anything that's said. The Chief Whip continued, the chairman or vice chairman has an equal right to the minister and opposition spokespersons to speak to the Dáil to outline the committee's work. Wow. The first stage, on the first stage, the proposer of a private member's bill now has 5 minutes to outline the purpose of the bill. So on and so forth. Changes to topical issues, changes to Dáil questions and so forth. And this is welcome. But to extend the previous metaphor, it's not exactly putting the Tsar up against the wall. Constitutional reforms have been proposed and some of them have been accepted by the people. What unites them is a protection of the fundamental structure of our political system. Cutting judges' pay may be good politics, but it isn't changing the way the country works. The Constitutional Convention, originally proposed by Labour as having a carte blanche to rewrite the Constitution, was given highly limited terms of reference. It has now completed its work, and none of its proposed changes, not even the harebrained one of giving teenagers the right to vote, addresses the structure or operations of our political system. Local government has been reduced in size, though not empowered. Corporate donations have been reduced in size. Soft gender quotas have been introduced. Brendan Howlin has been a reformer, but he has not been a bringer of transformational change. If you remember back to 2011, you may recall that a new era of professional management in the civil service had supposedly arrived, with the external advertising of positions and the appointment of an outsider to run the Department of Finance. When that same outsider departed earlier this year, he was replaced by an insider, and no external candidates could apply. The establishment of an independent fiscal advisory body by statute was also signalled as a great departure. It was supposed to make sure that politicians respected expert advice. It has now made recommendations for 3 budgets, and these recommendations have been rejected 3 out of 3 times. State boards were supposed to become more independent and expert, to be opened up to outsiders. In fact, as the actions of some recently departed ministers demonstrated, the rota of political appointments by party continues. And the defence offered for this extension or continuance of patronage, that, well, OK, we do it, but we don't do it as much as Fianna Fáil did it, is hardly substantial enough. Now, some things have changed in our country in the past 3 years, but I don't think it is possible to seriously and substantially make the case that the nature of our political system, the way we conduct our government and public life, has been changed in a profound or substantial way. The essence of our political system, of the way that power is structured and used, remains the same. Power rests with the government. Parliament is institutionally weak, timid and dominated by the whip system. Opposition parties and deputies remain primarily interested in how to get a hit on the government and get covered for doing so by the media. The civil service is conservative, and the quango and semi-state landscape is dominated by powerful agencies, each minding their own turf. This is the Irish system. But political culture is more than just the system. But I say it is a misjudgment to interpret unhappiness with the system as a change in the political culture. In fact, I think the system has managed to largely remain intact because the underlying political culture has not changed. The defining characteristic of the practice of politics in Ireland is the effort to obtain and retain power. This is how you get a government which does understand the need for change and believes it is delivering change, but will only deliver change which protects or enhances its own power. And the single biggest test for all political reform is this: is the government giving away power? The answer, I think, to all the reforms that the government has so far introduced, judged by this benchmark, the answer is no. They are not true and profound political reforms so as to affect the nature of our political culture. There's little difference in the behaviour of the opposition. Most days, the primary purpose of questions is to find ways of showing the government to be heartless and out of touch because it has not recognised the need to give extra funding to a group or service. There's no genuine interest in submitting comprehensive policies to independent bodies to cost not only the headline costs of individual policies, but their full economic and fiscal impact. Clientelism remains a dominant feature of the Irish political culture. It works at a local level, with parties putting more and more pressure on candidates to get out onto the doorsteps on a non-stop basis. At a national level, the race is to find groups who will be grateful for what you've done or what you propose to do on their behalf. The national interest remains defined by a succession of interest groups. And there's no escaping the fact that this is the case because this is what people are willing to reward. We want better, more effective national policy. However, there is as yet no indication that this will be our priority when deciding who to vote for. As Peter Mayer, the late great Peter Mayer, pointed out in this forum, many people believe that the government and the state is separate to them. Some people in politics today appear to believe that the government and the state is a sort of conspiracy against them. If you want a definition of how the political culture is largely unchanged, all you have to do is look at the debate on future fiscal policy. We have just been through a situation where we had a dramatic budget deficit which threatened the basic economic foundations of the state. A drastic programme of tax increases and spending cuts was required to bring it under control. So you might expect that now that we are reaching a point of stability, the priority in our debate would be about basic questions like what size the state should be, what levels of taxation are sustainable and appropriate, what services should those taxes fund. The basic distributional questions of politics everywhere. In fact, the only debate we have is how fast we can start spending again and whether we can reduce taxes on ordinary families, which in Ireland means everyone. The reaction to the recent local and European elections has been one of how fast can we get back to spending, not have we achieved a lasting stability in our budget. Now, it could be said that these same elections involved a major shift in votes to left-wing parties and independents, and that is true insofar as it goes. But in terms of votes, the two largest parties remain Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Equally, the last thing you get from the rest of the voters is ideological clarity. If they came together, the fourth largest party in local government could be called, I'd have stood for Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, but they wouldn't let me. If there is any coherence in May's results, it is the scale of the vote to protest against the system. So perhaps in 2011 people were too fast to see it as a realigning election. In some ways, it was more of a de-aligning election. People cut free of past commitments and started a search for what may be a long-term political home. Most have not found that home yet, because while people want to change the system, it's not yet clear that they want to change the culture. And notwithstanding Lucinda's teasing, which I have a suspicion may be coming to an end shortly, until that day comes when the political culture changes, there will be no real change in the way we do politics. Thank you.